It's the biggest superannuation fraud in Australia's history, with more than $200 million in retirement savings stolen. Today, a parliamentary inquiry into the collapse of Trio Capital found the regulators failed to detect or prevent the rip-off in time. It says the fraudulent scheme appears to have been set up to target Australia's $1.3 trillion superannuation system. And most disturbing of all, it finds the case exposes the significant vulnerability of the system. In a moment, I'll speak with the responsible Minister, Bill Shorten. But first, this report from Rebecca Bailey.
Our government does nothing to protect your superannuation. ASIC is refusing to prosecute the people who stole the money.
It's been a long wait for answers for the 6,000 victims of Australia's biggest superannuation fraud.
They have lost everything. Their life savings, their retirement money.
There remains a risk that similar frauds could be perpetrated.
Today, a parliamentary inquiry has found that investors in Trio Capital had their superannuation savings stolen.
As a matter of urgency, there should be a renewed criminal investigation involving the regulators ASIC and APRA, and as appropriate the Australian Federal Police and even the Australian Crime Commission.
The company was very badly run. Corporate governance was at an all-time low, and effectively one of the directors at least was subject to fraudulent conduct and has gone to jail.
How many prudential reviews did APRA conduct?
There were 5.
After nearly a year of hearings, the Joint Parliamentary Inquiry into the collapse of Trio Capital has found that the regulators APRA and ASIC failed to prevent or uncover the fraud in time.
I have a vague recollection that was...
It was only picked up because an alert industry participant notified the authorities. So the regulators, particularly APRA, failed to pick this up despite doing several reviews into the fund for 6 years.
We feel like we've been let down by the government regulators. There were warning signs over the past few years, and if those warning signs had been acted on, this fraud may never have happened.
Sally Bailey's parents invested their superannuation in a Trio Capital managed investment scheme called ARP Growth Fund. When Trio collapsed, the funds in ARP disappeared, and with it, their superannuation.
My parents, they've lost a significant amount, well over $1 million. I know that many individuals in the fund have lost millions of dollars, and yeah, it's really caused an unbelievable amount of stress to them and taken a huge toll on their health.
$650,000 worth of shares valued at $4 each on a company that's been deregistered for 2 years. So
Liquidators PPB Advisory have spent the last few years untangling the complex web that was the Trio Capital fraud. They've recouped $300 million in assets, but there's still more than $200 million missing.
Who ultimately benefited from it, we've got a fairly good idea who that is, but proving it can be fairly difficult. When you're dealing with companies that have transactions, say, through the Cayman Islands and those types of jurisdictions, they're not required necessarily to have record keeping to the same extent that we have here, so the trail can get fairly lost fairly quickly.
Trio Capital was established in Albury. Canadian Sean Richard was a founding director and remains the only person who has been convicted and jailed over the fraud. Trio was the trustee of a series of super funds regulated by the government watchdog APRA. It also ran a number of managed investment schemes, including ARP Growth Fund and Astara Strategic Fund. Up to $180 million from these were invested in the Caribbean in hedge funds controlled by an American lawyer, Jack Fletcher, who's now believed to live in Thailand. When those hedge funds collapsed, the Australian investors' funds disappeared.
Mr Jack Fletcher, somebody who has a long record of involvement in securities fraud, should be the subject of continuing investigation here.
Is he untouchable though?
Well, we won't know the answer to that until we can be satisfied that the Australian regulatory authorities have made every effort to pursue him and others who are suspects of being involved in this fraudulent activity. At this stage, what we clearly can say is that the Australian regulatory authorities have fallen well short of making every effort.
Would you be pursuing Jack Fletcher?
Look, we'll be pursuing a number of different parties. I prefer not to name them at the moment because we are pursuing them. And so we'll be looking at other legal avenues through our legal system in order to make recoveries which could become available to our estate here in Australia.
Sally Bailey's parents trusted their financial planner of 10 years, Paul Gresham. In 2007, Mr Gresham advised them to move their money out of an APRA-regulated super trust into ARP Growth, saying,
"I strongly recommend you accept the offer to transfer your interest in the PST to the fund."
Paul Gresham has given an enforceable undertaking to ASIC that he will never work in the financial sector again. He has changed his name to Tony Marr and disappeared.
He is one of the people who ought to be pursued, and there ought to be a criminal investigation into his behaviour.
While the federal government has recently tightened laws surrounding financial planners, in the case of Trio, a number of financial advisors received payments to encourage their clients to invest in the company.
This couldn't have happened without the money being attracted. A lot of that money was being attracted by financial planners supposedly acting in the best interests of their clients.
Restore my faith in government. Show us that white-collar crime is not tolerated.
While more than 5,000 Trio investors have received compensation to the tune of $55 million from a taxpayer-funded levy, more than 600 others will get no compensation because they were in so-called self-managed superannuation funds not governed by APRA.
People who invested in APRA-regulated funds have been compensated, but there are some hundreds of people who swam beyond the flags, who weren't in APRA-regulated funds.
It is unfortunate that the relevant minister appears to have tried to sweep this under the carpet by saying things like, I've compensated people who, in one category, but everybody else was, in essence, in his words, swimming outside the flags. That is not an accurate characterisation of what happened.
There may yet be some joy for some of the investors who are still out of pocket, like Sally Bailey and her sister Jane's parents. The inquiry recommends that the government should consider compensating the 75 unit holders in ARP Growth